Hebrews 12:1 says, since we have this great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every hindrance and every sin that easily snares us, and let's run this race with endurance, keeping our eyes on Jesus. How do we run with endurance? The quick version. First, recognize this is a spectator sport, people. People are watching you. Now, this great cloud of witnesses mentioned in this verse are talking about the people from Hebrews chapter 11. He said, all these people shall be remembered for this. And that their faith, and they saw the manifestation of their faith from a distance, and a lot of them didn't get to experience it. For instance, Moses looked over into the promised land, but he died on that side of the Jordan. And then the author of Hebrews goes on to say, lay aside every hindrance and sin. Now, since this apostolic in nature writing, which means, don't know if it was an apostle, but I know it's apostolic in nature, since this writing separates those two words, I mean, they're just telling me we need to find the difference between those two words. That while sin is definitely a hindrance, that doesn't mean that a hindrance is always a sin, right? Let's look at a couple of issues. Let's look at Egypt, okay? Let's look at what Egypt did in the Old Testament. At one point, there was a big famine in the land, and God used Egypt as a mighty resource and took Joseph all the way to the palace, used Egypt as a mighty resource to make sure that the Hebrew children didn't starve to death. But then a few hundred years later, Egypt had become an oppressor, and the people needed to leave there so they could re-inherit the promised land. Egypt at one point was a resource, then it became a hindrance. And seasons changed the other way too. You know, while Egypt started good, ended in a hindrance. You know, maybe that best friend of yours, maybe, hey man, we've been friends for 20 years. Well, maybe you should have been friends 20 years ago. So on and so forth. Sometimes people come into your life for seasons, and sometimes they're really strong at a point, and then they're not so much. And you know what? Hindrances go the other way also. Let's look at the story in 2 Samuel where David's going to fight Goliath. David, Saul says, David, hey, put on this armor, put on this, my heavy stuff and take my sword. And David's like, I can't move in these. These are not fit for me. It's not my time to be in these things. And he goes and slays Goliath with a sling and a stone. But then guess what David becomes? Later in life, David lives in armor. He carries the sword. He's one of the baddest men on the planet. Like Mike Tyson, the baddest man on the planet. So hindrances could go both ways. Sometimes it can be a resource and grow into a hindrance. And sometimes it'd be a hindrance that one day you grow into it becoming a resource. In the ESV, the Bible says to cast off weights. And they say, what is the point of this? So that you can run a race with endurance. So while a hindrance is something that may slow you down in your race, the next thing says, sin that easily ensnares us. Now, what's the snare do? Now, I always picture that big bear trap, right? The things you've seen in comic strips that the Barney Fife, the Gomer Pyle character, steps in, clamps down on their leg and brings them to a complete stop. Like I said, hindrance is a slowdown, snare is an absolute stoppage. Sin is like, yo, you can't do this and this. You can't run your race with endurance and have this in your life. Fellas, porn addiction is exactly that. Adultery is exactly that. Drugs are exactly that. Whereas a hindrance is more along the lines of tobacco. You have to slow down your race for Jesus to explain to someone why you still need Copenhagen. That's why I quit, baby. Not because it sent me to hell, but because I got tired of talking about it. And it says, run this race with endurance, keeping your eyes on Jesus. And you see, and I think about the story of Peter, and Peter walking on the water, and Jesus saying, bid me come. And Peter comes on out there. And then it says, Peter begins to sink, cry out, Lord, save me. Now, we don't know how far Peter sank. We usually picture he's flailing, right? He's down to his chest. He's splashing around. But you know what? It could have just been his ankles and he cried out to God. He could have been to his knees, his waist. He could have been all the way underwater. It could be the way we picture it. We're not sure. Yet, so long as he was looking at Jesus, his eyes was on the water. And then Jesus looked at him and said, you have little faith. And little faith, it means that the word that used there is a compound word that we needed two words in English to describe. And it was alipistos. And alipistos means something that is in short supply. And he's like, your faith was in short supply. When it met resistance, it failed. Jesus used the same word when he was talking to the disciples, and he said, because of your little faith, you couldn't exorcise this demon out of this boy that was thrown in the water and thrown into the fire. And I want to say Matthew 14. And he's like, no, once your faith met resistance, you paused. And he said, but you see, the disciples that couldn't do this, Jesus had just spent time on Mount Transfiguration with 3 disciples, and the other 3 disciples couldn't cast this out. They didn't have Jesus in mind. Peter quit looking at Jesus when he fell into the water. As long as we're praying, as long as we have our eyes on Christ and on glory, we'll run this race with endurance. We'll meet resistance and we'll continue on. Why? Because it's about Jesus. It's not about us. We'll run this race with endurance. When it looks like someone's getting a better promotion than us and someone's getting a people like that person more, you know what? You'd be like, hey, it's not about how much they like me. It's about me doing what Jesus has called me to do. It's not about if someone likes me in the midst of it. Now, bless God, if you've done some things that you should grow in to where people will find favor with you, more than do that. Then grow in those things and people will find favor. Honor God, people will find favor. But, so on and so forth. Keep your eyes off of what other people have. Get your eyes off of what you don't have. Keep your eyes on Jesus and you'll keep the hindrances out of your life. Don't step off into the snares that can bring you to a complete stop, and you can run this race with endurance. God bless.